Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all to the RIDE seminar. Thank you to those who are here in person. It's nice to be in Pomeroy again. And I want to thank you all who've joined us via Zoom. For those of you who don't know me, I am Amy Kinsley. I'm an assistant professor in Veterinary Population Medicine Department, and I'm a faculty co-lead of the seminar with Dr. Caitlin Feiock this academic year. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you that we'll have 2 seminars this month. The next one will be featuring Declan Schroeder. He is the Mark of Excellence Award recipient, and he will be with us on February 11th to share his work on virus evolution and transmission pathways. So for today, we have Leza Besemann with us, and she'll give us a seminar, and we'll leave some time for questions and answers. And then we'll also follow up with a panel discussion with some of our faculty members. Leza is a certified licensing professional with over 15 years of experience in technology transfer, specializing in innovation assessment, IP strategy, and negotiation. She has a Master's of Science in Chemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry from Binghamton University. She brings a distinct international perspective to her work, having served in university technology transfer offices in both Australia and England. Before joining the university, Leza was a global product manager for process analytical technologies at Thermo Electron Corporation. She has worked with customers in many industries, including pharmaceutical, food and beverage, and chemical. Let's welcome Leza, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you all today. I'm really excited to speak to the College of Veterinary Medicine. I think the last time I did one of these presentations was like 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, so it's good to be back. I don't often visit folks in this college, so this is a fun thing for me. So a little bit more about my background. So I actually have 2 different hats that I wear at the University of Minnesota. So one, I'm Associate Director in Technology Commercialization, so that's the Tech Transfer Office of the university. Those of you who aren't familiar with that office, we are responsible for protecting intellectual property, licensing it to companies, or spinning out new companies. We sit under the Research and Innovation Office. I also wear a second hat, which is actually kind of like my day job, which is I am a research partnerships manager, part of the Corporate Engagement Center. So the Corporate Engagement Center, I'll tell you about a little bit. So today I'm actually more wearing my corporate engagement hat and not my sort of technology commercialization hat, but I can answer questions for either one. Okay, so a little bit about the Corporate Engagement Center. The Corporate Engagement Center was launched in roughly 2021. It is a partnership between the Research and Innovation Office, so RIO, and the University of Minnesota Foundation. So our team is about 10 people. Out of the 10 of us, there are 2 of us who are technically part of RIO, and the rest are all part of the University of Minnesota Foundation. Our goal is to facilitate partnerships with companies. We have a portfolio of 70 companies that we actively engage with. These are companies that have a capacity to put at least $500,000 into the university, either through research, philanthropy, or other means. Our portfolio includes all the Fortune 500 companies in the state of Minnesota. We work with companies who are able to engage with the university broadly, so not just research, but philanthropically research, serve on advisory boards, hire students, et cetera. And then we work with companies who actually are not partnering solely with one college or department, but engage broadly across the entire university. What we do is going to sound a little bit different. We actually are an arm of the company rather than an arm of the university. And the way I say that is that it's easier for us to go to a company and identify companies who are able and willing to engage with the university and figure out what their needs are and then match make into the university rather than us sort of trying to promote every lab and center and college and department at the university to massive companies all over the globe. So our job is to really understand company needs and their innovation interests, and then matchmake in to the university's expertise. So we're also looking at working with companies who align with the university's strategic priorities. So for example, in the newest strategic plan for the university, one of the strategic imperatives is artificial intelligence. So we're gonna make sure we're engaging with companies around artificial intelligence across all different domain and technical areas, because that aligns with the university's strategic mission. So we use this wheel, which we call the corporate engagement model, when we're sitting down with companies to help companies understand all the different ways that they can engage with the university, from place-based partnerships where they co-locate on campus, to executive employee engagement where they might serve on advisory boards or teach in classrooms or be an expert at a conference or an event. Outreach and visibility is really just another way of saying philanthropy, right? Like sponsoring conferences, naming spaces, et cetera. Going down to the lower right-hand corner, workforce development. This is the primary reason companies come to the university, is really our talent. They're here to hire our students. All the other things are ancillary, to be totally honest. That's the first thing that they're interested in. And then lastly is the area that I'm going to focus on today, which we call technology and innovation. So this is companies engaging with the university's research enterprise, from sponsoring research to licensing technologies to sponsoring student design projects to using our equipment to having assays run in the vet diagnostic lab, all those types of things. So I'm going to narrow this down just a little bit, and we're going to kind of focus on how companies tap into the university's research expertise. But we're going to kind of narrowly focus on those things that probably are most relevant to an individual faculty member or PI. And that's going to be sponsoring research, using core labs, facilities, or having the university run tests or assays, and then joining consortiums. Everything else can happen too, but I think that's less part of your day-to-day. So why even partner with a company, right? I mean, it seems foreign, it seems like a lot of work, it seems like, wow, this is a path that not many people do, or I don't know how to make this happen. There's lots of benefits. And what I will tell you is that it's not as hard as you think. It's actually pretty similar to what you do to get federal funding and other funding. It's just that they might talk a slightly different language and operate on a slightly different timeline, but the benefits are all there. So the benefit that everybody gravitates to first is, hey, companies are a source of funding. Absolutely, they're a source of research funding. They're a way to diversify your funding portfolio. But it's not like companies are standing there just waiting to shell out money to researchers because you have some cool idea. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit. Interacting with companies is also a great way to get an understanding of sort of real-world commercial problems and what's important to companies. It might spur a new research idea. It might give you information to put into the introduction or something of another grant proposal. It's just a good way to get a different view on what a different part of the society thinks is a challenge. It's a great opportunity for networking and using that network to get your students hired. So just like you make connections at funding agencies and other universities and industry organizations, making those connections at companies is just another part of your network and just kind of adds to the depth of your connections. And then lastly, if you do have innovations that come out of your research that have commercial potential, obviously companies are a way to make that invention enter the market. So we're going to start with some myths. So I have 4 myths that we're going to talk about. I'm not going to talk for super long on each one, but I'm hoping that what I say sort of spurs either questions or whatever. And so ask them along the way. It'll make this a lot more informative for all of us. So first myth, I always hear this. Well, I can't work with a company because they'll prevent me from publishing, my students won't graduate, I won't have freedom to do the research I want. Oh, they're only interested in like their bottom line and getting a product to the market faster. So our worlds just collide and there's conflict. True, there is differences of opinion and how you approach things, but to be honest, those conflicts can be managed, right? Most of the time, the conflicts are around things like publishing, intellectual property ownership and rights and confidentiality terms. So what I can tell you is that for publishing, all of our research agreements with companies include a publication clause, which basically says the university has the right to publish this research and the company can't block that right. So the university has a policy, it's the university's openness and research policy. And that policy basically says that we must maintain the right to publish and have our research results disseminated. Now, if a company really pushes back hard, there is a multi-step approval process that you can go through to prevent publishing of the research results. I've been at the university almost 20 years now. I personally have never seen anybody actually traverse that entire approval process. So every research agreement I've ever seen still has publication rights in it. Intellectual property is another big one, right? Companies sometimes want to keep things as a trade secret or don't want their competitors to know about it, or they want to own everything that you do in your research because they sometimes see the university as like a contract research organization or like a design firm or consulting firm. And in those arrangements, the company usually owns everything, but we don't set it up that way. So the university maintains ownership of the intellectual property of all types that you develop. Only in rare situations do we actually let the company own that intellectual property. And then lastly, confidentiality. This is often a sticking point. So you meet a company, the company is excited about your research, you think that, we might be able to benefit or help them solve a problem. And then at some point, a lawyer perks up and says, but you need a non-disclosure or a confidentiality agreement because we can't talk any further until that takes place. That does happen, and we sign non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements all the time with companies. It doesn't prevent the conversations from moving forward. It doesn't prevent the research from moving forward. It just makes everybody feel a little bit more comfortable and safe that information's not gonna leak out. I think one of the challenges is that if you have students involved in a project, having them understand that confidentiality is important. And we'll get to the point of, who can help you with these confidentiality agreements. So really what this comes down to is that when you start talking to a company, you need to have really open, candid conversations, not only about the technical aspects of the project that you're interested in or the problem that they're trying to solve, but everything that goes along with it, like how important is confidentiality, what about publications, what about inventions? So it's all out there right out the bat, and there's no sort of like, ooh, I didn't know that was going to happen, and everything kind of shuts down. Thoughts, experiences, questions about this myth? Okay. Myth number 2, companies want product-ready results quickly, and academics just want to do fundamental research and kind of explore cool problems and kind of see what happens. There's definitely some truth to that myth. Timelines and priorities can be different between industry and academia. That's really well known. But the best collaborations really bridge that sort of fundamental research into practical solutions, right? I have had companies come to the university and they're like, okay, can you find us a professor who can develop the next product for us? And I look at them and I go, you know what? Our folks are great at fundamental research, translational research, but they're not going to deliver a finished product to you. So we're probably not the best solution to that. Companies who come to us and are like, we really want the university to investigate this area because that information is going to be important to our next product development cycle. Those are the companies that sort of fit the university model the best, or companies coming here to do translational work or clinical trials or things like that as well. This is where you really need to have a very candid conversation with the company. You really need to make sure that the milestones in the project that you're undertaking for them are very, very clear. So typically in federally funded projects, the aims can be quite broad and a little bit nebulous that allows you to kind of maneuver from one way to the other depending on how the research develops. Companies aren't so keen on that. They like really tight deliverables where they know what you're going to give to them. And so making sure that there's really clear milestones and well-defined deliverables is very important. Then that gets to like the budget and timeline, right? You need to make sure that the budget and the timeline are doable for both your lab and the company. Companies tend to want to move very quickly. Sometimes depends on the lab. It might take you a few months to get a grad student in place, or things are going to go slower because you have a second-year grad student versus a postdoc working on it for whatever reason. You just need to be clear with them as to what the timeline is, so there's, again, no surprises. And then companies like to get updates generally pretty frequently on projects. Some companies don't, but the majority do. And so understanding, like, do they want to meet weekly? Do they want to meet monthly? Or do they just want to see a final report is really important as well, so that you can factor that into the workload of your lab and the workload that you're taking on as well. We use a tool called an innovation blueprint when we're meeting with companies to kind of help scope out some of these questions. And we actually start with a very fundamental question, which is, what does success look like, right? So we say to the company, like, okay, you're going to come to the university, you're going to partner with us. What is a successful outcome? What are you expecting to get from this? And the answers to those questions will help you figure out if it's a company you can work with, if your motivations and objectives are aligned, and then the details around the scope of work and the budget and various things kind of fall into place. Thoughts on this myth and kind of challenges that people may have faced?
Do you find that companies are doing shorter project timelines, like a year or two versus like a 5-year NIH project, or are they, what are you seeing?
We date first and then we get married, right? So if you have a new industry partner that you're working with, most of the time their projects will be under a year. Most of the time, the companies are going to do seed funding, so under $100,000. Sometimes companies might be willing to fund a grad student for an entire year, which ballpark across the whole university is somewhere in the $150,000 a year time frame, depends on the college and department. But they generally don't fund 2-year projects right out the gate. They definitely don't fund a 5-year project. And if they do, there's very gated points where they're going to make a go, no-go decision, and they might just flat out cancel the project, right? One of the challenges I face is that I have researchers who come to me and they're like, hey, I've got this great idea for a center. 3M's going to want to fund it. It's $5 million. And I'm like, well, what's your existing relationship with 3M or whatever company? And they're like, well, I don't have one. I'm like, well, it doesn't work that way, right? That's like 25 years of marriage, and we're talking, let's start with dating. So that's a great question, yeah. So partnerships start small and then advance from there. So if you have a successful project with a company, they really like your work, they will come back and continue to fund your lab over and over again. Myth number 3, there's only one way to partner with industry. There's just one model and it works for everything. Definitely not true. I'm going to run through a whole bunch of different models and mechanisms for working with industry. But like I already alluded to, you can't jump to the agreement. You can't jump to the partnership model initially. What you really need to figure out first and foremost is, what does success look like and how do you want to work with them, right? Are you going to work collaboratively? Are they just funding research in your lab and you're going to deliver them the results? Is part of the work being done at the university and part being done at the company? All those kinds of things have to be worked out. And then once you figure out how you want to work together, then we'll figure out what the model is. What often happens is somebody decides what the model is and then tries to like fit it in, and it all goes wrong, right? So I always encourage folks to start first with the what and the how, and what you want to see come out of it, and then we'll figure out what the model is. So I'm often brought into conversations to help figure out what that model should be. That's a great way to utilize me. I also take, hey, this is my first time working with a company. They asked me these questions. I don't know what to do next. Can you help me out? I'll either coach you through that process, or I'll get on the call with the company with you and kind of guide both the company and yourself. So partnership models include everything from sponsored research, which looks, you all know what sponsored research looks like. Sometimes using core lab facilities or having us run tests or assays, et cetera, for them. Could be a consortia or a center. It could be sponsoring a student project or a capstone course. It could be fellowships and internships, just depending on the situation. It could be licensing as well. So there are lots of different ways to make it happen. And the agreement and all the legal stuff generally comes later. Is this like the scariest piece for everybody? Like this is the part that's most uncertain? Or does everybody kind of have a handle on all the different models that you can use when working with companies? So there's 2 of us on my team. That's solely our job, is to figure out how to make this stuff work through the university. I have yet to come upon a situation where I couldn't figure out how to make it work, right? I have connections at SPA and OGC, and I've been in industry, and I understand the university, and I understand both languages, and I usually am able to navigate it to make it sort out one way or the other. The challenge is if either party is like, well, I can only do it this way, right? It has to look like this, then it's a problem. If everybody can step back and say, okay, here's sort of the key building blocks, how do we put this together in a partnership model framework and a legal agreement to satisfy both parties, then you can get to a reasonable outcome. It might take a little bit, but it'll get there eventually.
Do you have models in which the company would like to kind of be more embedded in your research too? Like I had a company saying, well, we don't want a situation in which you only see us for the money. We also want to be part like mentoring committees for the students or be part of discussions. How do you handle that when you're trying to in some way protect the students or protect,
Yeah. So the question was, we're all sort of accustomed to just having a funding agency or a sponsor just give us money and let us do our research. What do you do when a company wants to get more embedded in your lab and wants to provide more oversight or guide students or be on advisory committees, et cetera? That's for you to work out with the company, right? There's nothing in the university's policies or procedures that say that can't happen, but it's really your preference. So I know of a partnership with CFANS and a local company where the company's not funding the research, but it's truly a collaboration. And so part of the research is done here, and then they send materials to the company's lab. The company does a whole bunch of things and then sends the materials back to us to process, right? It doesn't look like company funding research and walking away. It's truly a collaboration with both sides providing effectively in-kind resources. And as long as all the parties involved are okay with that and there's a framework to make it work, it's acceptable. So if you had a company who wanted to serve on a student's advisory committee or whatever, and you were okay with that, that's fine. If you wanted an arrangement where a company technical person came into your lab to do work, that's possible also, right? Just like if you have another faculty member from another university coming in to do research during their sabbatical, we have visiting researcher agreements, right? The person from the company is effectively a visiting researcher. We have mechanisms to make that happen. So I encourage folks not to just kind of say, oh, this isn't possible or it's different, but if you truly have a partnership that you want to build and you want it to look a certain way, let's figure out if we can make it work. And then the fourth myth, I think this is the one that is the biggest hurdle to get over initially, right? I think folks think, I already have to have existing industry connections to make any of this happen, to have a partnership with a company. But how many of you actually have existing industry connections that when you were either early in your career or deciding to have more partnerships with companies, right? You have to build those connections. You have to build that network. It doesn't just come to fruition. And this is probably the hardest part, but at the same time, there's also easy paths to make it happen. I think this is the reason why a lot of researchers just steer away from industry partnerships, because they just don't know how to get started, right? You know who the program manager is for federal funding. You know who somebody else is in a sponsoring organization. But I feel like every company's a little different. People's titles are a little bit different. Their org structure is different. And so then it feels like difficult to navigate. Also, there's so many companies out there, not only in the US, but globally. How do you figure out which ones to work with? And so I think that's kind of the biggest challenge to making it work. So how do you go about building connections? First, you just have to think about networking opportunities. And these are just right there for you. They're not hard to find. It's just that you may not be used to looking for them. So how many of you intentionally go to an industry-heavy conference? So not a conference that's mostly academics, but like a trade show or a industry-heavy conference versus your sort of traditional academic conferences. Anybody? Yeah, those are great places to identify companies, meet technical folks at companies, start up conversations, see what they're working on, see what their new products are. Those are great ways to connect with industry. How many folks use LinkedIn? How many of you used LinkedIn to go find somebody at a company? Not many. So believe it or not, most folks will respond to just a cold call through LinkedIn. So if you do a bit of digging and searching and you kind of know what companies you might be interested in working with, you might be able to find somebody who's a University of Minnesota alumni or somebody with sort of the right technical background and reach out to them and see if you can get a conversation going, right? And that conversation can be as simple as, what are some of your challenges that you're facing as a company? Like, where's your innovation headed? So you can get a feel for what's of interest to them, what problems they're trying to solve. And then maybe there's conversations that happen around potential research partnerships. How many of you get contacted by companies because they saw one of your publications? Anybody? Yeah. Right, so that's another great way, right? Companies are looking at the academic literature, they see things that are interesting, they reach out to you to learn more. That's another way to develop your network and find potential collaborators. Also, college and department advisory boards is another great way, right? These are folks who are already friends of the university, they're already in companies, they're probably more than happy to speak with you and kind of maybe point you to another contact within their company. I'm not sure how many consortiums and centers exist in the College of Vet Med, but that's also another way to connect to industry. And then lastly, and I already mentioned this a little bit, but professional association meetings, right? Another place to connect with folks from industry. The alumni connection is really important. If you have students, former students who are now working at companies, you have to stay in contact with them, right? That's probably the best way into a company is through alumni or former students from your lab. Like, they're friendly to the university, they know how the university works, they understand their company. That's a really easy networking point. And then lastly, and I'll go into this in a little bit more, there are third parties that can help make those connections. So the Corporate Engagement Center will help make those connections if we have those connections at companies. We don't necessarily have connections at every single company across the globe. Like I said earlier, we focus on roughly 70 portfolio companies. There are also third-party platforms, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, one called Halo Science, which is another way to connect with companies. So you have to sort of take that leap and start making that networking happen in order to make those connections with companies. More thoughts on, or questions or concerns around the networking piece?
So with our stuff, we work with a couple people related to licensing of our IP, and
Yeah.
then that's usually Raj and,
Yeah.
and Allison
Yeah.
for just the progression of our IP to patents. Are they the ones to go to try to have the university make connections with companies, or is this corporate engagement group more of a separate group that's better?
You have technology commercialization, and we have IP managers, for lack of a better way of describing, and licensing officers who are responsible for protecting university IP and then licensing it out to companies. And then we have a separate group, Corporate Engagement Center. Both groups are touching companies, but for very specific purposes. So this is where I literally wear both hats on a daily basis, right? So the technology commercialization group, they are solely interested in finding a licensee, a commercial partner, to take an innovation and turn it into a product. And so that's their sole mission. Sometimes it bleeds into like the company expressing interest in sponsoring research, not usually. The Corporate Engagement Center is kind of wearing a bigger hat in the sense of engaging with a company beyond just licensing. So like in my role, all things research enterprise. So Raj and Allison from TechCom, they would not talk to a company about like using analytical capabilities at the university or sponsoring a senior design course or helping a student get an internship. But the Corporate Engagement Center would, but we work closely together, so yeah.
At the beginning, I thought you said that your office engages companies and those companies express what their areas of need are,
Yeah.
whether it's a specific problem or something like that.
Yeah.
But in this particular example, you're saying the only ways to overcome this myth are us faculty building relationships sort of de novo.
Right.
And not through identifying companies that have needs
Yep.
that are already out there.
You kind of caught me. So I'm telling you what you can do as an individual, right? My job is to bring those opportunities that I'm aware of to the faculty and researchers who have that expertise. So it has to work in both directions. The Corporate Engagement Center, we're only 10 people. We don't have the capacity to help each individual faculty member market themselves or each lab or core facility. So you have to be proactive in trying to build those connections. You're welcome to come to me and say, hey, do you have any contacts with these companies, or do you know what these companies are interested in? And we'll provide all that information. At the same time, for example, I wish I had more examples from your space, and so I apologize for this, but I'll give you the most recent example. So Sherwin-Williams, who happens to just be across the river, came to the university and says, hey, we've decided the University of Minnesota and Case Western are our two strategic university partners. We want to do a call for proposals at the university. I said, great. They've committed to funding one-year projects, as many as they find that they like. So we worked with them to put out a call for proposals. There was like 16 different topic areas. We have a launch event scheduled next week, and I have personally sent to departments and individuals, et cetera, trying to drum up interest in this. So that's my role, to kind of land those on your plate and make it super easy. But you can't only be waiting for those, because, for example, we don't have a lot popping up. I don't have one with Zoetis or other animal health companies. So it kind of has to go both ways. So I'm giving you tips on what you can do as an individual faculty member or researcher, but there's also folks at the university who are trying to bring opportunities to you on a golden platter. So.
I do a lot of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work. And some of it's with CFANS through a center there. And they generated an externship program that actually supports industry or government partners time.
To
Yeah,
come
to
in.
come, I think, to decrease some of the risk of
Yeah.
partnering with academia. So do you know of any other strategies like that that you've seen? Because I think the idea is that we invest this money now, but long-term that'll come back because these partnerships will be funded.
Right. So I've seen industry fellow programs. So iPrime, which is a center in the College of Science and Engineering, has a program where companies can send one of their technical folks to work in a university lab for 3-6 months. I've seen Japanese companies send people here for a year. The company pays for the cost of the person to like make that transition, like they cover their salary. We don't charge the company anything because it's like a free labor in our labs, right? And for our research projects. And then there's a mutually agreed upon project or aim that they're working on. And then oftentimes the company is like, oh, wow, we've learned a lot. This is a great lab. Okay, now I'm going to go sponsor a research project, or I'm going to hire this student or take a student on as an internship. So yes, for sure. Yeah.
Is there a listserv faculty can subscribe to know when those RFPs go out that you have?
What we generally do is when we get those in, we look at the interest areas of the company and then identify the college and department where it makes sense. And then we push it to the college, we push it to the departments and ask them to push it out. And then we'll send out individual ones where we know kind of the alignment is spot on. So it's a little bit of a manual thing. I'm going to go through some of the funding stuff right now as well. Okay, so University of Minnesota resources. There is a web page on the RIO website called Building Successful Industry Partnerships. This is a set of resources specifically for faculty and researchers at the University of Minnesota. It tells you how to find partners, how to get started, agreements, there's some videos. And then externally facing, we have a corporate engagement website. This website is for companies who are coming into the university and are trying to figure out how to navigate the vast complexity that we have. So this is the web page on the RIO website. There is lots of information. So a lot of what I talked about today is on this website. Things to consider, how to build industry partnerships, including kind of a step-by-step approach. Tons of information here, past webinars, et cetera. If we have time, I'm happy to actually bring up the website and surf it for you. This is the Corporate Engagement Center's website. So this is for companies coming in. Companies can find all the different ways to engage. So that wheel model that I showed you initially has basically been translated into a web page. So for technology and innovation, we list kind of different ways companies can engage. This site's less useful for faculty and researchers. If you had a company who generally asked the question of how could I work with the university, I'd point them to this page. Here's another external resource. It's called University Industry Demonstration Partnerships. The university is a member of this organization. Anyone with a University of Minnesota email address can become a member for free. There's tons of resources and guides on this site. But what they do is they often have webinars on industry grant and partnership opportunities. So for example, there was recently one from PepsiCo talking about how to partner with PepsiCo, topic areas PepsiCo is interested in, et cetera. These come every so often, but that's another kind of great way to identify connections. And most of the time, the folks presenting those webinars their sole job is to make connections. And so they're used to getting emails from folks that they maybe have never met before. How many of you know that we have a Google Sheet? It's not pretty, but lists all the external funding opportunities or calls for proposals that the Corporate Engagement Center is made aware of from companies. Okay, so it's not protected, it's just an open Google Sheet. It lists everything we know. There's some classification, categorization, but you can see what is available. Most of these funding opportunities are super easy to apply to because companies don't want 10-page single-space proposals. They literally want like 2 pages bulleted just to get a sense of if your research area is even heading in the right direction for them. We are particularly enthralled with this resource called Halo Science. Halo Science is free, you can sign up. There are calls for proposals from all different companies in all different sectors. It takes less than an hour to submit a proposal through Halo. It's probably more like 40 minutes. You don't even really have to do any prep. It's just a form that you fill out and you provide a link to your website. They send it to the company. Company makes a pretty quick decision as to if it's interesting or not. If it's interesting, they usually ask for a meeting to kind of talk about the details, and then it rolls from there. We've had several projects funded through Halo. Halo's also been backed by NSF. So they got NSF funding to figure out how to help emerging research universities partner with companies. So yet another resource. We put all the Halo opportunities on that Google Sheet as well. And then I've linked here a bunch of sort of success stories. Forever Green has gotten $2.5 million from Cargill to kind of help their initiatives. Cisco, we developed a partnership with in 2021, and they have funded 20 plus projects. So there's an example of once you kind of get the ball rolling, it doesn't stop. And then our latest is doing these call for proposals where companies commit to funding 3 to 5 seed projects with the hope of those seed projects leading to larger projects or seeking joint federal funding. So there's my contact information for those of you who want it. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm also happy to go back to any of the links that I showed, like if you want to see the Google Sheet with the funding information in it, or if you want to see the Building Research Partnerships webpage, I'm happy to help bring that up and navigate it. This is your time to tell me what I've presented that's interesting to you, what questions you still have. Without a lot of feedback, I'm not sure where to go. So.
I was at Washington State University before this, and we got Zoetis to pay patent costs for a compound that we had. But trying to work with them, subsequently, we just run into these hangups, like they didn't want to pay overhead.
Right.
And it was like this hard no on both sides, so just, and the university would try these very unsubtle things, like they take my budget, stick the overhead into it,
yeah.
And they'd be like, why do you need $100,000? And I'm like, I don't, So it was, but then the other thing I ran into with WSU was that because they paid for the patent costs, they lost interest after the person that was kind of pushing it left the company.
Mm-hmm.
But then the university was reluctant to pursue other partners because they felt like, well, Zoetis kind of had first dibs on it. So it just ends up being in this kind of, and I don't know if you run into
yeah.
that, and I don't know if that was, WSU being, I think they were a little naive.
Yeah, so I'm going to break your question or your comments into 2 parts. First part, let's talk budgeting and indirect costs or F&A rates. And then part 2, we'll talk about sort of licensing and patenting and paying patent costs. So let's do the one that right now is like a thorn in my side. The whole sort of budgeting, indirect rate, the university's super crazy detailed budgets, et cetera. Okay, when we're working with companies, they don't need to see the ridiculously detailed budget that you need to send to SPA. That just is ripe for way too many questions and then pushing back on why are we paying for this? Why are we paying for that? Yes, we have an indirect rate or an F&A rate or an overhead rate, but so do companies. They just don't show it the way that we do, right? If Zoetis was to go to a consulting company or a contract research organization, they would absolutely have an overhead or indirect rate. It's just they hide it. They don't show it as an explicit line item. So the company never questions it, right? So then when we break it out, they're like, well, why? What does that mean? And then I often have to say, well, we need to keep the lights on and labs need to be kept running. Like this is facilities and administrative expenses. It's generally overhead. So my recommendation is actually to bundle it in. So you're just showing here's the cost of the research, big buckets like people's time, which would be salary and fringe, materials, travel, whatever else it needs to be, and not break out the indirect cost. The biggest challenge I've seen is I've seen PIs tell a company, okay, this research is going to cost $100,000, but they forget to put the indirect rate, and then it goes to their pre-award person who says, oh, you left out the indirect rate, and now it's actually a $150,000 project, right? And the company says, well, wait a minute, I was budgeting at $100,000. So before you get too far, check with your pre-award person to make sure the budget looks reasonably right, or just make sure that you've got the indirect rate already bundled into it. You have any suggestions on budgeting for companies? I want to hear what you do.
So I've had a number of situations where the indirect costs, I've never given it to the companies, but SPA gives it to them. So I have no control, and at the end I have to fight the battle afterwards. So I think the communications are always the PIs with our university and how they structure these contracts, because I find really trying to patch relationships after the fact. And we also have a situation where we also live in a world now where indirect rates are being pushed on universities, and your companies see this. And they don't necessarily understand that this is not necessarily settled. This is not really a real agreed upon rate, and so we're fighting that perspective as well. So I find it really hard to make these decisions because as a PI, I have no control over it. So this is the problem, isn't it? The university hasn't quite worked out how to communicate with industry. That's what I think.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the budgeting one is one that I actually recently am trying to figure out how to make this work more smoothly, because I've seen everything from PIs talking to a company and they just assume the company's going to give them a gift, but it's not, because the company wants intellectual property terms and other things, and so it can't be a gift, and now the budget's been provided to the company incorrectly, right? I was not aware that SPA provides a budget that looks different than the original budget you provided the company, so that's news to me as well. Because typically the SPA grant contract officers that I work with don't provide the really detailed budget to the company. They usually just leave whatever was in the original scope of work. But there are other GCOs within SPA that are less savvy on working with companies, and so maybe it's those folks who are used to doing federal or foundation work and don't realize that it's going to potentially cause a problem.
Does the budget justification has to say that indirects are included or not? Usually in the I agree, sometimes to a SPA, I will tell them, this is only for you, but this is what I will share. So
Yep.
it's the same total, but
Right.
presented differently. But in the justification, do you have to say X, Y, and Z indirect cost
So the question is, in the justification
of the budget?
to SPA, you
Or
need
to the company?
right, but you don't have to justify the budget to the company. You just provide the budget to the company.
I normally don't ask someone to write one if the company doesn't ask for it anymore, now that I know that person hasn't been asking. So that's the good, we can keep that internal. Same thing with the detailed budget. If we tell them, don't send the detailed budget. Now, I don't know if anything in post-award during contracts that up being communicated.
That's happened to me.
I was
where
gonna say,
I've
because
sent
at
a
the pre-award
separate-
side, we can say, this is for internal use only, just give them this Word document with the scope of work and the very aggregated budget categories.
But for companies that have pushed back on the indirects, trying to just include them in the budget, just put them in and don't have a separate line item, that then detailed budget, because SPA wants the detailed budget, gets appended to the contract. And then I do the same thing where I have to clean up afterwards because they're like, the totals are the same, but this is totally different than and we don't want to pay for that. So
You may just want to proactively say to SPA, please don't put the detailed budget, because it does cause problems for sure.
How do you give broad categories, still get the dollar amount to match, but not make it obvious that there's overhead included?
There's no rule that you can't group things together, right? The only rule is internal budget justification, what has to go to SPA so they can put it in the accounting finance system correctly. But what you put in front of a company, to be honest, there's no rules about that. I've seen some departments, it's literally 2 lines. This project is going to cost this much for one grad student, for 1 year. I mean, that it is so simple. Does that solution work?
There's also a problem regarding the way
the problem we create by doing this then with our accounting, right? Because then we spend the money and we short on that budget because we have to now incorporate something else. And then you have to find a way of massaging that money is to move it to different budget lines. And so it's not that straightforward. Part of me almost wants to declare to the company what the indirects are. Let's just play it up front and let's agree up front, right? But it's so hard to negotiate because it's, the details keeps changing within different layers within the university. I do believe in just being clear up front. Let's make this indirect costs and make it clear to the companies. And some of the companies have also been in academia. They understand that indirects is required. So we don't have to be playing games with them. They know this.
So some companies understand the indirects and some don't. So it's hard to know what the right thing to do is. It seems like bundling it out the gate is the least problematic unless you get down a path where they're providing all the details and then you can't get past that. So, but I think the absolute worst solution is when no one puts in overhead, the indirect, that's given to the company first and then it comes back with the indirects on it. That's a complete game changer. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it back over.
First of all, thank you to the panelists. What we're going to do, I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly, and then we'll start the questions, and I will let them to tell us more about themselves and their experience working with the industry. The first panelist on your left is Dr. Luciano Caixeta. Dr. Caixeta is an associate professor in BPM, works mostly in ruminant production medicine, and he will tell us a little bit more about himself in just a second. The second one in the middle is Dr. Gerard Cramer, also a professor in BPM, in the ruminant group as well, interested in doing food health research of cows, in cows, so very good. And Dr. Caitlin Feiock, okay, very close. An assistant professor in veterinary clinical science department and is the manager of the Clinical Investigation Center. Okay, so with that, we'll start the first question, and then again, try to keep the questions short or the answers short, just because I have a bunch of questions. But at the same time, please tell us more about yourself. The first question I would like to know is what motivated you to pursue industry partnerships?
The line of work and the research we do, so as Monse mentioned, I work with dairy cows, a lot of work with stakeholders, and we do a very applied research. So the industry is a natural partner because they are there selling their products or selling providing their services and many times competing with us as consultants. So it was an easy connection with them because sometimes I'm just like, some of the people that we're consulting are using their products, and then we connect to the people in the companies like, they're using this way and the results are not as good as the fact sheet that you gave them and all that. So that's how it started. So it's a lot of the applied things that we do.
So Gerard Cramer, I'm similar to Luciano. I work in the same industry. I work probably a little bit more specialized. So there's a lot less people working in my area, that also means there's almost no federal funding for it. I've applied for federal funding, but I think I don't have, other than internal grants, I have had no federal funding during my time here. And same thing, the need arises because the existing relationships we have, and you're just talking to them pushing them for data, right? So I work in an industry where there's not a lot of data about things, so then you push them for data, and eventually they come around and say, okay, well, would you sponsor, do some of that type of things? And the other thing is because the reputation as a researcher we have, people come to you saying, okay, we want to do this type of thing, would you be willing to work with us in that type of thing? So it's requests coming from that way. That's kind of how we got into it.
Yeah, can you hear me? This doesn't sound on. Okay, I'll just talk loud. So industry kind of found me. I didn't really have motivation, but my entire job actually is helping to be an intermediary between our clinicians in VCS, and then we work less with VPM and VBS, but we're trying to fix that too. But oftentimes, a lot of the clinicians actually have really low like research effort, and so they don't have a ton of time to be writing grants for these big federal funded proposals. And so really kind of my role is to connect them with industry partners to be able to actually do research that they're interested in, but they kind of don't have to take the time to try to chase down funding. So that's mostly my role.
So it seems like all of you have been working with industry partners for a while. Can you in some way take us back to that first project or that first interaction on how did you go about getting it started? And then what did you learn out of it that helped you do better after that?
Yeah, we all had access to the questions before, and I was thinking about the first one because I don't remember how it came about. I remember it's very different. So it was with immunostimulants for calves, and I don't work with calves before. So, and I didn't work before, and I don't work with it anymore. But I believe it was in a conference that we were there, and then when he was talking about conferences and the industry conferences or the associations, and the three of us in the Rumen group were in the back. Many times when I go to a conference nowadays, I probably spend 60% of my time on meetings that I set up before I go to the conference with companies. I think this is dead now. And then I go and watch my grad students present, and then maybe 1 or 2 sessions. And most of my time in the trade show because of these connections with industry. So again, I don't remember, but like there are other one. I can remember the second one that came to me through a collaborator that knew the type of research the company needed and how I do it on the field. So that's how it started. And then there's other companies that approached because they needed help with collection of data. And then, yes, we provide that as a service, and then that generates that connection, and then other projects come about.
Yeah, so same, like I'm trying to remember my first one, but my first one was with a calcium meter. And that's kind of how the way I think both Luciano and I operate is we have our objectives for an industry partnership, and then we have the company's objective, and they're not always the same, but they're together, right? So this is kind of the first one where I said, okay, they had a calcium meter that they want to test it to see does it actually work, and I had an interest in relating calcium status to the lameness, the area that I work in. So we kind of piggybacked the projects together, saying, okay, I'll collect the samples and do all that stuff, trying to get at the calcium meters. And then I can see, okay, because I have calcium status now from 2 sources, I can correlate that to lameness stuff that the research question I had. So that was kind of the first one that I started with. And what I learned from it was that I don't want to work with calcium. Leave that for Luciano.
Yeah, I kind of got thrust into managing like multiple partnerships at once that I didn't establish. So that has been just a challenge in general, but I think most of my job right now is actually because there's a lot of startups that think that doing things in dogs and cats is just cheaper and faster than doing them in people. And so a lot of my job is educating tech startups that while $25,000 seems like a lot for you to shell out to us, it's not going to do much. And so, yeah, that's most of my days these days.
So it seems like all of you have experiences with multiple companies, right? So what are the attributes of working well with a company? What are you looking for in that partnership for yourself and that it's mutual benefit? And then that on the good side and on the bad side, is there anything that as part of the relationship you say that's a deal breaker? Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I say that one I thought about too. Like, I don't think there's a deal breaker as long as the budget is adequate. So if they pay the annoyance fee, which you can put in, like coming from a clinical aspect, like we have clients that get charged the annoyance fee. Some companies will get charged that too, which would be built in whatever we want to do. Like we charge for more of my time or more of the student time. But usually I never had a problem with a company that being like not ethical. So if that will be the only deal breaker, but most of the things they have an objective and was alluded to like, they have a bottom line. So I try to understand what it is. I have a very business-like mind that I try to understand why they're trying to do those things. And as Gerard mentioned, try to just align what I can do to what their objectives are. So yeah, it's hard to tell like what makes it work is just like make sure you are aligned, they are aligned with what you do, or at least there's something that you can do. Like I have never had a problem of having another like $5,000-$10,000 on the budget to do the project that I want. And I also tell them like this is extra, like it's not what you need, but like I'm gonna use this to do my work. But they're already paying for a lot of the personnel, so like it becomes cheap at that point because personnel is definitely the most expensive.
And very similar. I think, yeah, if there's deal breakers, if they not willing to pay what we like, overcome the hassle factor, right? I've done one project that was a nightmare. This started out me telling the company saying, well, I don't believe your product works. And they're like, well, we have sales data. And I'm like, that's BS. And then some government agency pushed them and says, hey, you need some real data. And then they came to me and I said, I don't want to do this project. So I set a budget that was this high. And then they said yes. Right? But that budget funded for our first postdoc that we had together. Like Luciano and I share some of the research. So, but that made it worth the effort, right? It was a pain in the butt project, but we got very well compensated. And so that was the thing that kind of like, yes, that was a barrier, but I don't want to say we can be bought, but we can be convinced that it's worth to do things, right? And that was, I just said, okay, well, if you're going to do this, you're going to pay for me, part of my salary, you're going to pay for the statistician, you're going to pay for a postdoc. And they're like, okay. Because their need was high, right? I knew that they needed to do this work. So understanding what the company needs out of it and seeing how far you can push it was key in that scenario, saying, I don't want to do this because this is a pain in the butt. And once I knew and I had a colleague, I had a friend or an acquaintance inside the company that eventually told me, like the first time my budget came to the CEO, he about dropped on the floor. And then he's like, well, we need to do this. Like, you don't have a choice really, right? But that's like, if you're going to tell me you don't need data, well, that's where like the ethical thing comes. Like, okay, I'm going to be ethical. I'm going to present you this data. But if you're like, I need to be compensated for that. Or my research team needs to be compensated for that.
I think the most successful partnerships that we've had are ones where we both trust each other's expertise. And so having companies that come to us because we're experts in animal health, those have been most successful rather than companies trying to tell us things about animals that they just have no idea about. The places I struggle in finding common ground are, because I work with a lot of client-owned animals, and so I think that there's just a different mentality for some companies, or again, it's some of them come across as like, well, it's just dogs and just cats, and it's like, well, no, that's actually like not accurate, and it's not how we are also beholden to our clients, right? And so we have to make sure that they also feel comfortable participating in these clinical trials and that I have reasonable evidence that this is at least going to be safe. And some companies don't do a great job with providing us with that. And so then we come to a stopping point in the negotiations and then they get a little crabby. But yeah, that's kind of step one for us. So.
Reminds me of the question, my own experience. One time I did a project at the beginning when I joined the university on a project I did not want to do, but I did it. It was a pain in the butt. It was more work than what I thought it was going to be, but I did it to invest in the relationship. Because then they end up after funding a very generous project that I graduated a PhD student in a completely different area that I wanted to do. So I did it for the investment on the relationship more than the project itself. So it's an extra effort, but sometimes it's working. Before I ask another questions, any question from the audience here?
Gerard, have you ever leveraged your industry funding to get additional funding? / I know the answer, but I think it's worth sharing how like it's not even just industry funding, it can be then used to secure even more funding and what that was like for you.
Yeah, so that's a great example. So the project Shannon's referring to, there's stuff happening in the sphere I work in, and one of them is AI. So there's camera technologies out there, and then there was a national organization that was interested in using that for other purposes. And to be honest, it's genetic purposes. I'm not a geneticist, I'm an epidemiologist, so it's a small g, little e. So I'm like, I'm not sure I want to do this, but if we can align objectives to say, okay, I have an interest in seeing, does this technology actually work and is it useful to the farm? Can we align on that? And they're like, okay, well, we'll fund you to start looking at this technology, to basically validate the technology. Does it actually work? And then the next step for them was to get genetic evaluations. So they invested in me, basically, in my research team for 2 or 3 years with the objective saying, okay, we'll be a matching partner for a much bigger grant. Right, so then they said, okay, if you do this work, and we'll just keep applying. So it was 3 applications before we finally got the grant. But that matching partner was invested enough because they had an ultimate goal of getting this genetic evaluation for the industry. And I had a goal of saying, does this technology work? So it was slow progress, and there was hiccups along the way. It was a $2 million grant in total, right? But that so that was $2 million. Like it was $1 million from the agency, and then 500 cost match from my original partner. But they probably invested almost close to 500,000 before we even got to that stage to kind of lay the groundwork for that stuff, right? So it was, like you mentioned, a long-term relationship. It was really a long-term relationship. And it all started by somebody saying, like, I'm the lameness expert in the industry. Like, the original camera company reached out and said, hey, we want you to work with this. And then eventually the other organization says, okay, you're working with this already. Can we partner on some of the stuff? So I think your point about relationships, that's truly how this all started.
I want to go back to indirect costs because I'm actually in the process of trying to negotiate something with a industry partner right now, and I've been told by our grants people that if the company doesn't have a stated indirect cost in their bylaws, they have to go 56% unless you can count the research as a clinical trial, in which case it's 30%. And I guess when we're trying to have these discussions about budgets, I don't know whether or not SPA is going to accept the proposed research as a clinical trial or not. And so it's hard for me to figure out which value I should be used, and to get the 25%, I have to have the company share their bylaws. And so I was just thinking, like, I think the suggestion online or by the speaker was to just have it all packaged in initially and not break it down. But it sounds like to me, it sounds like there's a lot of back and forth about the company justifying a lower indirect cost rate, or that the university accepting that your research qualifies as a clinical trial or not.
I don't even think if they're going to accept it because they are clinical trials, right? So I run with 30%. And when there was the discussion on the indirect cost, I was puzzled a bit because I never had an issue, and I always I'm upfront, and I'll put a plug for Shannon and the research office. I always contact her, can you put a template of the budget even before I do the first form that you always send me, that I forgot the name. And then she always tell but don't share this with the company. So I just use that to get me a number close enough that I'll tell them, this is the number, it's close enough. And I always tell them that there's indirect cost. I never had to deal with the 56 one because my research are truly applied on commercial farms and it's clinical trials. So, but my experience so far, I never had a problem. They would understand, and I have partnerships with a consulting company that does research, and they don't charge indirect costs, but they charge more of their time when they put their budget together. So that's how it comes out. And it comes out about the same 30% extra when they do it. But again, on my partnerships, I was always upfront. It's I give them the total number, and that includes indirect costs. And when they come and look at the budget that has like 5 lines, there's like a direct cost, indirect cost in total, but they're aware it's within. Like many times, I also, like when I started talking to companies, I ask them what they want to do. So like and I know what I want to do, and I tell them like, how much do you have to spend to this? Because if you don't have enough to make this work, like we better stop here. Like I'm not even putting like a 3-page document or a budget together because it's not gonna go anywhere. So they will never tell you like exactly how much, but like at least they would give you like, I can spend 150, 200,000 or 30, and then you figure out like, I can do this much for 30, I can do this much for 100.
Mine's very similar. I've had some experience with like where they have the bylaws, or like, because this was a nonprofit, so they had like, we only pay 10%, so that was easy. I've never had the 56% because kind of like Luciano, it's always the 30% like on-field stuff. But same thing, I mention it up front, and I like it. Usually mine is up in a line item. It's like, okay, this is the indirects, and then, but I have the conversation before we even give it a number, like this is going to be the number, and there's going to be this university fee is what I call it for doing the research. So I kind of package it, like, and I prep them before it, and then I just go, this is what it's going to cost, that type of thing. But probably the key is to have that conversation. So when you give them the number, they're expecting that there is going to be that thing. And if they ask you about it, you kind of say, well, this is how our system works, right? Blah, 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 blah. You explain the indirects, and then because it's the 30%, like, and I always can say, well, it's not this, right? So I prep them with the 54, and then we go to the 30, right? If you don't have that option, that's a different discussion. But the key, I think, has been just to have the conversation up front, saying this is going to be part of the budget, and we just have to pay it. That's the cost of doing business.
I don't know how Spot determines that, so it's your point.
Yeah, I probably should know, and I don't. Because pretty much everything is considered, if you work through the CIC, it's a clinical trial, or it's federally funded, which is then at the 54, 56, 55, whatever you're working with. But yeah, kind of similar. Even though in my like budgets that I send to companies, I will kind of just like include it in the Excel like cell with, multiply it by 1.3 or 1.5 or whatever you need to do. But I do, when I send them, I say that is inclusive of indirects. And then if they have questions about what indirects are, then we can chat about that. Some companies, they literally just won't pay them. And then I am like, okay, well then I guess we can't do this, because then it ends up with, we're now losing that money, right? Like it comes out of our budget, and I don't have the budget for that, so.
I want to make a comment, if you don't mind, about companies and the bylaws on the indirect groups. I also seen situations in which the company didn't have it, but then, you would ask them, and then they just write a letter, say, oh, this is our policy. They just made it in that moment, you could tell, and it's, 15%. So in that case, I actually had to put my department chair hat. I said, no, you at least push for this, right? So it's a bit like some companies will also play the game because they also have limited funding, so.
I was going to say, I've gotten around that. I made the mistake once of saying, well, if you have it written in your bylaws, and then they made up bylaws. And so I have learned that the way I kind of get around that is I tell them that this is the rate. And then if they come back and say, well, we won't pay that rate, then I ask to see their bylaws to see what's in. I don't even tell them that they could pay a different rate. I just say, okay, do you have it somewhere in your company policy? And if they can't provide me with a policy, then okay, like I won't even tell them that they could pay a different rate. But I know a lot of foundations have it written in, and it's easy enough.
IDC waivers, which I hate doing, and they lose us money, and they're a pain. But I will say for Gerard's project, the only way we could do it was to waive the indirects because the sponsor had insane rules. And so the university, I had to go all the way to the vice president of research, but we made the argument that waiving this means we'll get it, and $1 million of matching funding. And if you don't approve this, the $2 million is totally off the table. So we were able to show like a cost benefit analysis a little bit, but I've also done waivers where I'm not requesting a full waiver. I might say, hey, I know it's whatever, 37% for other sponsored activities, which we could talk about too. But they'll pay 25, so could you waive 15? It's like an easier ask instead of saying, can you waive it all? Can you waive part? I haven't seen a lot of F&A waivers getting denied, but I think with all the indirect costs hootenanny with the government, they're probably getting nervous and not wanting to approve a lot. But I don't think I've ever turned one in that was denied because we don't do them lightly. But if we can bring something else to the table to sweeten the deal, like they are willing to pay some. I mean, Monty has to sign off too. So like, that's why I say I don't offer it up lightly, but if it's this or the project is dead, we might choose something over nothing, so.
We compensate for it other ways, right? So to get the waiver, we had to be able to tell the university, okay, we're getting a lot of salary for this person to make this happen, right? So there are other ways. I think one of, like Luciano, I think both would agree with that. You have to be really creative, right? To say, okay, how do we make this work? If you want to do the work and you have an interest on both parties, there's a way to make things work, right? Just be creative. Don't think in the box. Just say, okay, well, what about this? What about this? And Shannon probably hates me because I'm like, can we do this? Can we do that? Right? But that's what I think it takes sometimes to get things done.
It is harder to do that though if you've already sent them an initial budget. So yeah, I like that idea, and we've done similar things with some of our investigators, but you have to do that negotiating internally before you've sent anything to the company, because then if all of a sudden your effort is now double what it was when you initially sent it to them, they're gonna like say, what? No.
Usually I don't give them a budget. I just say, this is what it's going to cost. And then they see it after the fact. Okay, this is what the breakdown is. Like, I very rarely have sent them a complete budget. I'm like, this is what it's like, as we're negotiating, saying it's going to cost this much. And if we agree on that number, we've already agreed on the number, not what the breakdown looks like. They're like, I don't really care because we've agreed on the number already. So I've done the budget, like work with Shannon, like we have everything in detail, but I just tell them this is what it's going to cost. And if they're like, well, we don't like that, then I go back and say, okay, what can I do or not do, and go from there.
Maybe just one last question because we are right on time. Just some closing remarks and very short. And is there anything you would do differently now that you have all this experience, or that you've learned that you would do differently? Just very close.
Yeah, one closing remark that builds on what was said. Like, if you have a chance to over budget a little bit, because we are really bad about like figuring out how much it would take us to do things, and if we just make it like just right, you're gonna be under budget. Like then you're gonna use your discretionary to cover it. I wouldn't change much what I have done. Like, and I'm really proud, and I really like my industry connections. Like, cause I have like graduated will be 5 students now, and only one was funded by USDA. Everything else was industry funded through like patchwork, right? Different projects, and like we have a postdoc together, and I have a lab tech, and it's all funded by industry through different projects. So I would have nothing to change.
Probably like looking back, I would have focused more on what I was really interested in to start with. But I think the piece of advice was just be creative. Like, there's different ways to do things. Like, we have service contracts that bring in money to support people. We have research, but it's all focused. Okay, this is what we want to do. This is the people we need. How do we get that done? So I would argue we probably push the boundaries, but we're very creative and try to get funding that we think is necessary.
I think the one thing that I have learned, I don't know if it would change anything, but especially when working with like med tech companies, is always add a couple of months for your timeline, because they do want to be super aggressive, but oftentimes they're coming to us because they're a little bit of a captive audience, and so you do actually have the room, and that just makes everything better for everyone.